So it's a pleasure to be here. Dan, I'm going to give you a really brief introduction to the National Science Foundation, a little bit about the structure of the Biological Directorate. We'll talk, for most of the talk about dissertation improvement grants, one or two quick words about the GFRP, and then hopefully there'll be time for some questions. NSF is a branch of, as part of the executive branch. So the director of NSF is a presidential appointee, and we answer to the president. Our mission is to promote progress in science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense and for other purposes. This was the act in 1950, and there wasn't a DARPA, there wasn't an NIH, there was just NSF then. Some of these have moved elsewhere, but what hasn't changed is we are the place you go for support for basic science. We have a budget of about $6 billion. A big, large chunk of that goes to the operations in Antarctica. We make about 11,000 awards a year, over 40,000 proposals. We support about 200,000 university faculty, students, researchers, and fellows. And about half of the program officers, about half the science staff at NSF are rotators. Those are faculty members who come for 1 to 3 years to serve as program officers and then return to their home institutions and their labs. And that's completely unique in the federal government. There's no one else that does this. Maybe reasons why they don't do it. Okay. We are in the Capitol Beltway. At 4201 Wilson Boulevard. There is our building. It's corner 9th and Stewart right here. It's the grand entrance to NSF. If you're ever up at the Ballston Metro stop, come by and see us. We also have international offices. The Office of International Science and Engineering, OISE, is the place you go if you have questions about international collaborations. We have 3 overseas offices, Paris, Tokyo, and Beijing. This is what NSF looks like. The National Science Board and the director and the deputy director, these are all appointed by President Obama and his staff, who these people answer to. The National Science Board is also unique. It's like a managing board for NSF, and it was established in the at the very start to prevent the director from having too much power and changing the direction of the agency. NSF operates very independently from other government agencies and, in fact, from the government in general. We mainly deal with the Office of the Inspector General. These are the lawyers and police officers of the federal government, and yes, they do carry weapons. In fact, they investigate fraud, and they will have something to do with our talk today. The director has some staff, and then there are these directorates. There are 7 science directorates, and then 2 offices for budget and information resource management. This is my directorate here, biological sciences. And so to get a little closer look at biological sciences, the assistant director is John Wingfield, and there are 4 divisions. The DBI, the Division of Biological Infrastructure, the Division of Environmental Biology, the Division of Integrative Organismal Systems, and the Division of Molecular and Cellular Bioscience. Each of the divisions is divided into clusters that handle a specific kind of research. When you send a proposal of any sort to NSF, you send it to an appropriate cluster. If you send it to an inappropriate cluster, they will return your proposal without review. That will also be important later on. There's also one virtual division called Emerging Frontiers, which gets all kinds of strange things that no one else does. DEB, this is my home, research on population, species, communities, and ecosystems. These are the sorts of things that clusters within the Division of Environmental Biology would be interested in. Primarily things like biodiversity and phylogenetics, life history, evolution, ecology, biogeography, ecosystem sciences, global change. Integrative organismal systems is focused on the individual organism, plant, microbe, animal, etc. as the unit of biological organization. And their areas of interest are things like behavior, development, neurobiology, physiology, and structural biology. MCB is interested in molecular, subcellular, and cellular levels. Various clusters there include biomolecular structure, cellular process, genetic mechanisms, networks, and regulation. And finally, DBI, Division of Biological Infrastructure. This is where biological informatics resides, funding for collections and field stations and for instrumentation. Also, some human resources are in DBI, including undergraduate mentoring, the two postdoctoral research fellowship programs that currently exist, and research experiences for undergraduates. Now, it's a very important thing to recognize about the field you're going into, and it's a very lively field, which is great. I assume most of you are biologists, so this is all from bio submissions. If you look at the annual number of proposals, you see a fairly dramatic trend over the past decade or so. Nearly a doubling in the number of proposals submitted to NSF. There's also a profound trend in the funded proposals, that the number of projects funded has remained approximately constant for the last decade, and as far as we can tell, will remain that way for a while. And all of that put together means that the rate of success has declined substantially from somewhere in the mid-20s, around 2000, down to, actually we're at 10 or lower right now. So this is sort of core-wide, all of our programs. Funding is very, very tight, very, very competitive. On top of that, more and more universities want faculty to seek external research funding, because as state money dries up, they turn to the foundations for funding and your grants and awards. So this is the world you're entering into. You know, what's that mean? That you will have more pressure to get funding as a faculty member, so it's a good idea to start to get used to doing this now. It's much harder to get any given amount of money to do your research now than it was a decade ago. And the success rates are much, much lower than they should be. There's an unfortunate level of stochasticity now in the top funding categories, where we can only fund about half of the top ranked proposals that we get. And that's a very hard phone call to make, to tell somebody that, yes, you got all excellence and were recommended as outstanding for funding. No, we're not going to fund you. So, everyone who's thinking now about, gosh, selling insurance doesn't sound like such a bad deal. You know, maybe that's an okay life. I don't blame you. But we're here to assume that you're plunging ahead. And we're going to talk about your first grant, for most of you, your dissertation improvement grant. It's a unique program, and of course its purpose is to improve doctoral dissertations. We do not fund dissertations, and we're not interested in funding yours. We are interested in funding an improvement on it. you have restricted eligibility. That is, you have to be admitted to a PhD program. You have to pass your comps and be admitted. And now, this is the hard part here. This program is available to any program in NSF. Anyone can offer a dissertation improvement grants. In bio, the only parts that do are all of the programs in the Division of Environmental Biology. So that's evolutionary processes, phylogenetic and biodiversity sciences, ecosystem sciences, and population community ecology, and in iOS, animal behavior. That's it. If you're a molecular biologist, there are no dissertation improvement grants for you. If you're a physiologist, there are no dissertation improvement grants for you. Don't send them to us. We will return them without review. That's just not our area. So, you know, unfortunately, only certain people can apply. This isn't a practice grant. It's a real grant. It's really reviewed. It is funded in the same way that other federal grants are funded. And, of course, it's not appropriate for all PhD students. Not everybody needs a chunk of money to improve their dissertation. Not everybody's working in an area that can be funded with a dissertation improvement grant. You have to decide whether it's worth your trouble to go for it. Now, quite generally, writing a grant, this is the weakest part of dissertation improvement grants, and probably the weakest part of others. Many young investigators begin by thinking that there is something so exciting and compelling about studying the tubercles on the back of a lobster that they can't wait to tell you what they're going to do about it. That's not a proposal. Your proposal is not going to be read by anyone that cares about that. They might be interested in the sensory systems of lobsters. They might be interested in homology of certain parts of crustaceans with other organisms. They might be interested in the ecology of a lobster and how it interacts with its environment through its physiology and its characters. But if you don't tell them about that stuff, they're not going to get it. They review the proposal you send them. They're not there to review the proposal you should have sent in. So you have to begin any proposal with the conceptual and theoretical framework that got you interested in the topic and that's going to make it accessible and interesting to the broadest possible range of fellow scientists. That's where you begin. And that's what goes on page 1. Why should somebody care about what you're doing? Why should any biologist within your general field care about your research? That can be 20% or so of a proposal. Why does your research matter? What big problem are you contributing to? Then you're going to offer some hypotheses about how your research relates to this big problem. You will generate testable hypotheses. Then you will introduce the system you've chosen to study this and why. You're going to justify why this system for these hypotheses. Then we get to some specifics, specific questions. How are you going to design your experiments? How are you going to assess the relevant aspects of your study system? And finally, you're going to produce whatever amount of introductory or preliminary data you have to show, number one, that there is a problem. A proposal that begins, I think that these insects have chemical defense and that it's important in their life history. I'm going to study their life history. Step one, do the insects have a chemical defense? You're done. The review is over. You're not going to get funded. You have to have preliminary data that shows that the problem you're going to study exists. That's the most important thing preliminary data does. You also have to have a little preliminary data just to show your chops, that you're capable of carrying out a research project. Your data has to relate to the specifics of your system. You can't believe how many proposals we see that produce preliminary data that doesn't have anything to do with what has actually been discussed. And even worse, your data has to come back and allow some way to distinguish among your general hypotheses. The data that you present, your preliminary data and the data you're going to collect in this phase, has to be able to test these hypotheses. These are the fundamental questions that the reviewers are going to be asking. Is this an interesting and important project? Do they identify testable hypotheses? Do they have a plan for addressing those hypotheses? Is it an appropriate system to do those? Is the data they're going to collect allow them to draw any conclusions? If the answer to any of those questions is no, you're not getting funded. All right. So let's go into these a little bit more. You need to have a very strong conceptual framework for your work, for your research. You need to be linked to some major body of thinking, preferably some major body where there's actually controversy, where people have something to debate, where there are unresolved questions. You are going to contribute to those. And you need to show that you know that there are unresolved questions and that your research can address those. Your framework is going to motivate your hypotheses and the questions. This big picture view, the hypotheses ought to simply flow out of that. And your results, you have to be able to show that what you're proposing to do is going to advance your field in a way that is fairly obvious. It's very important that your research that you're proposing actually tests the hypotheses that you discuss and not some other unstated hypothesis. I think you could all imagine that that would be an advantage, but it's surprising the number of proposals in which there is a complete disconnect. Okay. Those don't get funded. So you really have to think about how your data addresses the hypothesis. Hypotheses or questions, I don't really think it matters exactly how you frame it, but you should always think about alternative hypotheses. Nobody really likes a study in which either something cool is the result or nothing, or we learn nothing. If those are the alternatives, that's not going to be a real high priority funding. It's great if there could be one really exciting outcome and there could be one less interesting but important outcome, maybe a confirmatory outcome. That's okay. But you should have some alternative outcomes and you should lay those out and explain that you know that there are alternative hypotheses and you explain how you're going to test them. Your results have to be able to distinguish among those hypotheses. You need to explain in your proposal how you're going to use your data to do that. Slight frame shift there.
Yeah.
A little preliminary data goes a long way. You need to show, again, that your work is feasible and that the phenomenon or pattern that you are going to study actually exists. You have to have preliminary data for that. You're going to be asking for money to improve an ongoing dissertation. That means it's expected you have some results. You have some preliminary data already. And they'll want to hear about where you are in your dissertation and how this funding would improve what you've already done and what you have left to complete. Make sure that you are not making claims that you can't support. As don't anticipate the outcome of all your experiments. You can talk about possible outcomes, but whatever you do, don't act as if you already know what's coming out. You don't. You shouldn't. You need to explain why you've chosen the system that you have. Not just that it's good looking or that it was nearby and convenient, but why, given the conceptual framework you develop, given the hypotheses you've drawn from that conceptual framework, why have you chosen this system to answer that set of questions, to address that set of hypotheses? Sell it. Why is this the system to answer some much more general question? And why are you choosing the variables that you have? How will they allow you to distinguish among your competing hypotheses or to answer the questions that you've proposed? Don't assume that it's obvious. NSF wants you to address broader impacts, and we'll talk a little more about that. Make sure your plans are reasonable. Nobody expects you as a graduate student to, produce a film suitable for national television as part of your broader impacts. You don't have the budget to do it. We do have PIs that have that in their budget. Okay. But that's not probably reasonable for you. You need to convince the reviewers, however, that what you're proposing will actually happen, and they've become much more picky about this. When you say, oh, I'm going to mentor a high school teacher and let them hang out with me during the summer, the usual question asked is, have they ever talked to a high school teacher? Do they have the permission of the administration to talk to a high school teacher? Does the high school teacher want to be involved in this? What kind of thing is the high school teacher going to get that makes them want to do this? Are they going to have class? Is the student going to go into the class and make presentations with the teacher? Are they going to design experiments? Have they contacted anybody? Talk's cheap, right? Let's have a plan. Make a plan. Show that it exists. Show that there's something really there. And it should be integrated with your research. There should be a fit between what your broader impact activities are going to be and what your research is about. It's a really good idea to use some reviewers that you can get hold of right now, like other people in this room, and ask them to take a look at your proposal. Don't worry if they're not in your field. The people that are reviewing your proposal aren't going to be either. So, you're going to get reviewers who don't have a lot of expertise on your specific field. If your colleagues, if you're an ecologist and your ecology colleagues, whatever their stripe of ecology are, don't have a faintest idea what you're talking about in your proposal, that's a really bad sign. Any person in the general field who understands that kind of science ought to be able to evaluate and appreciate what you're doing. If you've written your proposal in a way that they can't, it's not a fundable proposal, and you might as well stop working on it if you're not going to make it better. So, ask your friends to read it, ask your advisor to read it, ask them to, be critical, to tear it apart, ask them if they would recommend this for funding, and if not, why not? And you might tell them like it's a really competitive funding atmosphere. So, you got to be harsh. You really have to think, is my proposal really one of the best that it could be? Who reviews these proposals? So, we recruit a variety, so each of the clusters in in the Division of Environmental Biology has a DDIG panel. So in evolutionary processes, we recruit a range of about 20 to 25 evolutionary biologists. There will be people that work on phylogenetics, there are people that do biogeography, there are people that do Drosophila and Arabidopsis lab studies, there are people that do QTL mapping in the wild, there will be a gene expression person, there will be an informatician, there will be a couple of statisticians, there will be a theorist. The range of evolutionary biology. And we will assign your proposals to them as best we can in terms of fit. It's a sure thing. You're going to have 3 reviewers. It's a sure thing. At least one of them is going to be from an area of evolutionary biology that's very, very different than what your proposal is about. And that's important because they have to become enthusiastic about it. They all need to be enthusiastic about it. Supplementary documents. You need a certificate. There's a template for this. We ask you we get a lot of them that don't even have your name on them. That's really not appropriate. It should be a piece of paper that has your name on it and the chair of your department or someone equivalent who signs it and says you are a candidate for a PhD. There is a 1-page document, the Context for Improvement, that is to describe how these funds will substantially improve your dissertation. If you start out and go, I cannot complete my dissertation without this funding, your dissertation improvement grant will not be recommended. It's got to improve it. It can't pay for it. There's not enough money to pay for your dissertation. So make sure that's clear. Why and why you couldn't do this piece without the money and how it'll fit into the whole thing. Letters of collaboration. If you have collaborators or someone that's going to help you with the broader impacts, a very brief letter. The text should say something like, I agree to do what is described in the project description. Signed, whoever. That's all. Any that say, gosh, this is a great project, what a super idea, we will remove those and no one will see them. Just so you know, the reviewers don't even have to look at the letters of collaboration. They are not required to. And there should be no endorsements in there. We're not interested in what your colleagues think of your research. We only want some brief statement that says that they know they've been asked. By the way, to say that I'm going to work with somebody when you've never really talked to them, that's called fraud, and that's the thing we report to the Inspector General's office, and someone with a gun could show up at your office to ask some questions about it. Okay? That's illegal fraud. Okay? Just so you know, you're capable of committing crimes. Oh, now this is the bad one. Okay.
Oh, actually, we have a workaround.
Oh, good.
Yeah, that's good.
But you should know this. Anyway, the Inspector General's office has ruled, as was ruled a number of years ago, was decided that cost sharing by institutions and the National Science Foundation to support projects was not, as a condition of funding, could not be allowed. Because that would mean that wealthy institutions could post a larger contribution to a project to make it more likely to be funded than a poorer institution. And government funds can't really be distributed to universities in that way. That's not appropriate. So cost sharing is ruled illegal. This last year, the Inspector General's office noticed the dissertation improvement grant solicitation, which did not require students to put the indirect costs that are paid to universities in their budgets. Indirect costs here at Duke are 57%, so if you ask for $10,000, your budget will actually be $15,700 because the grants office will add the indirect costs that pay for the grants office, their legal representation, the accountants that manage these funds, the lawyers that make sure that no laws are being broken, no federal laws, the people that inspect your animal care facility to make sure that's fine, the power and lights that run your building, the staff that support your teaching and research. All these things are paid for out of your indirect costs. NSF does not negotiate independent indirect costs. They are negotiated by the Office of Naval Research for all universities in the United States and for all U.S. government funding agencies. So never complain to us about indirect costs. We have nothing to do with it. Okay? They have been decided by the Naval Research what's fair. Your university has made a case for how much it wants. They are audited on a regular basis and is reviewed whether they are using those funds appropriately. Okay? And if they're not, then their percentage will be adjusted. But that's the catch. These now have to be included. So that means that here at Duke with 57% indirect cost rate, your dissertation improvement grant, in fact, is only going to give you about $9,000 and some change in your pocket, and the rest is going to go elsewhere. Unless something else happens. And Mohammed thinks something else is going to happen, which I have nothing to do with. Your budget will have these in it. And if you don't put them in your budget, we're going to send it back and ask you to revise it. You have to have these budgets. We have not yet gotten a ruling on whether we can send the grant back and ask you to revise it and have it resubmitted, or if we just have to return it without review. So, make sure your grants office, when they review your grant, they are going to make sure this is in there. The total budget on a DDIG is limited to $15,000, and that includes the indirect costs. The main things these can be used for are for travel and supplies, computer time, etc., but you can't pay yourself a salary for it. I believe you can fund a student with a stipend, but you can't pay them a salary. An undergrad, say. There are other ways to get undergrads to work for you, though. I wouldn't waste my dissertation improvement grant money on that. Sort of the general flow here. You submit your proposal. We check it for compliance. This is the stage at which we will be looking this year. Have you got your indirect costs in there? Do you have 2-page bio sketches with no more than 10 articles in them for all relevant personnel? Is your text, your project description 8 pages or less? Do you have references that are in an appropriate readable format? Have you checked all the right boxes on the cover sheet, etc.? If you're compliant, we move on. A program officer looks at your proposal, evaluates it initially, and decides if it's appropriate for a particular panel, and it'll go there. We select a group of panelists to come to Washington, faculty members in whatever field is appropriate. They come to Washington. They each of these people will review about 15 to 20 dissertation improvement grants, and they will write reviews for them. And then they will come to Washington and they'll discuss the reviews they've written, and they will come up with a recommendation. They'll work in groups of 3, and they will make a recommendation to us about whether your project is an outstanding one, a superior one, or meritorious one, or not competitive. The recommendation they make is not a, does not determine your funding. It is an important factor in what the program officers, like myself, will consider when we are deciding who to fund and who not to fund. It's rare that a grant that has very low ratings from a panel would be selected for funding, but it may be that not all of the top grants will be selected for funding. And we have a variety of concerns that the panel doesn't address that we have to. So at that point, either your proposal is declined, or we recommend it, and you get a nice phone call from a program officer, and you drop the phone and go screaming down the hall. That has happened on more than one occasion. And the Division of Grants and Agreements, assuming that Duke University has the fiscal structure in place to manage a federal grant, will make an award. The timeline on this is about 6 months. This is pretty fast for us, but the panel will be meeting somewhere. You know, your dissertation improvement grants deadline is in November. The panel meets in February, and we will be letting people know probably in April and May. The reviews. It's only the panelists that review dissertation improvement grants. There aren't ad hoc reviews. What we ask the panelists to do is to focus on the quality of the project and the two review criteria, the intellectual merit and the broader impacts, and we will go over those in just a moment here. What we do then is we compare the proposals and the recommendations with our priorities and the things that we think need to be funded for a wide variety of reasons, and we select based on that. Once again, these reviewers may not be experts in your particular little field. If you write your proposal so that only 5 people in the world can understand it, it is very unlikely that one of those 5 will be in the room to be an advocate for it. And most of the rest of them will just go, who cares about that? And that's absolutely critical. One of those 3 reviewers has got to be ready to stand up on their chair and say, this is one great proposal. This has got a clear conceptual idea. It's got a great set of hypotheses, perfect data for testing it. It's a cool study system, and they have strong broader impacts. You need at least one of these in there. Tricky, huh? All right, the review criteria, very briefly, intellectual merit. These things are all in. You know where you read about these things? Where? The Grant Proposal Guide. Memorize those words. Grant Proposal Guide. 6 months before you write a proposal. Ooh, that's a little late. Better now do it now. You read the Grant Proposal Guide every time. Every time. It changes. And it has a lot of really useful, valuable information on it. Wouldn't you want to know what the basis that your project is going to be evaluated on before you write your proposal? That would be a really good idea, wouldn't it? You could actually address what the reviewers are going to be asked to look for. It's all in the Grant Proposal Guide. You know how you you know how your undergraduates, you know how they hate to follow instructions in lab? But you make them, right? You make them. And the reason is because you know if they're going to be scientists, they got to follow instructions to work with the federal government. You know that. Right? So look at the Grant Proposal Guide, and it details these in great length. The most important thing is the proposal to advance knowledge in your field and across field. We're very much into interdisciplinary research, and we'd love to hear about how your project's going to advance other fields. Your project should be creative and original, and it should just sparkle with brilliance. I'm sure most of you can do that. You need to establish that you're qualified to do the research. You do that through appropriate citations, through key phrases about the techniques that you're going to use, things that indicate you know what you're going to do. Do not copy the instruction manual from a PCR kit into your project description. Nobody wants to read that. Nobody wants step by step, I'm going to do A, then I'm going to do B, I'm going to do C. In a few words, show you know what the process is. You want to show that you have concepts, you understand your field, and you're organized. You know how your research is going to address some big problem. And you need to demonstrate that you have access to the resources you need to carry out the research. Broader impacts. There's 5 categories currently. You don't have to do everything. Just pick something and do a halfway decent job of it. Advancing discovery while promoting teaching, training, and learning. This is what almost everyone goes to. You know, I'm going to mentor some undergraduates. I'm going to work with a high school teacher. I'm going to, talk to a high school class, something like that. That's all fine. That's all good. Make sure you've actually talked to a high school teacher. Make sure that what you want to do for the high school class, they would let you do there. Make sure you have permission from the school principal to walk on campus so they don't call the police when you show up. Once again, saying you're going to do these things without actually having laid the groundwork to do it is bordering on fraud. If you say you're going to collaborate with someone, make sure they're a willing collaborator. Broadening the participation of underrepresented groups. This is probably the thing that we worry about the most at NSF. We can just show tons and tons of evidence that increasing the diversity of scientists makes our field better. Okay, and for you, you are going to be the mentors for the next generation. That's the right thing to be thinking about. You're going to be their models. And so incorporating diversity into your lab and diversity in your research, that sends the message to your students that this is the way things have to be. Tremendously important. This is also a point at which fraud creeps in. We have had investigators, for example, talk about research with tribal colleges and name faculty with Native American colleges that they were collaborating with, for whom we, a year later, sent a request for a report, and the faculty member calls us up and says, "What is this? I've never heard of this grant." And we say, "Well, you're on it, and you have a budget." And they go, "I do. Nobody's ever talked to me about this project." Somebody went to jail on that one. Okay? That's fraud. So think of ways that you can incorporate a diversity of students into your research. Infrastructure. Realistically, in a $15,000 grant, you're probably not going to establish a lot of infrastructure, although just contributions of sequence to databases is considered partly infrastructure and partly dissemination. Websites to make your work more accessible. Appearing on the local TV show. Appearing on national TV. These are ways that you can disseminate broadly. And benefits to society. So, for example, the National Science Foundation doesn't fund conservation biology, and we don't fund biomedical research. One could study ecology that produces knowledge that's of great importance to conservation biologists as a broader impact. Or one could be doing some kind of research that has a very strong biomedical application as a broader impact. That's fine. That's fine. And you can go on about it in there. But the major Intellectual merit has to be the basic science, not the application. And I always, ask someone, we're not going to ask you to do everything. It's a small grant. We know that you have a dissertation to complete, but you have a role. You're taking taxpayer money. There should be an opportunity for you to give something back to the taxpayers in some way, and that's what broader impacts are about. Oops. What else goes into a proposal? You don't need to include any results from prior support in a DDIG. If it is a resubmission, as you got turned down before, a response is helpful, and we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. This, I've kept saying this, right? The framework, the hypothesis, too system specific. You write a proposal about your little piece of turf right here. This is just not good. You need a broader conceptual framework. Think about the big picture, how your research fits. Design of study methods and data analysis, things like sample sizes, replicates, power, these are really easy for reviewers to look at and ask, are these experiments adequate? If they're not there, they have no way to judge whether it's an adequate project or not, and it won't do well. Those details are critically important, and they're easy to leave out, but they're things that any reviewer, whether they know your field or not, they can tell if you are sampling enough to do what you claim you're going to do, so they want to see that. Don't avoid potential problems. You may know that, hey, everything could go horribly wrong at some point, and that things won't work out the way that you plan. Don't send it in and hope that nobody figures that out. They will. They will. Deal with it head on, Say what's uncertain. Say where you might have problems. Try to come up with contingency plans. Explain what you'll do if it goes wrong. Include your broader impacts. Include a justification for why you're going to spend your money the way you are. Fundable proposals have new, exciting ideas. The first page, the reviewers going, this is a great project. If they have trouble making it through the first page, you're very unlikely to get funded. A great conceptual or theoretical basis that's clear and understandable. Does your project advance understanding of some basic important question in your field? Can you really resolve something with the experiment you've designed? A good focused working plan, very important. Can you show that you know the subject area? Fatal flaw, a key paper, a key citation in your field, you don't include it. Oh, the lead author of that's on the panel. In fact, they're the head reviewer. Your proposal's going down the tubes. Okay? Yeah, so know your subject area. Be realistic. Don't promise the moon. Be realistic. What you can do with the money you get. And again, it has to complement your dissertation work. Each of the panelists writes a review before they meet. So they don't see the other reviews when they write their reviews. They're independent. Again, those reviewers may not be experts. What they have to say in the review is more important than what ranking they give you. We don't pay a lot of attention to the excellence, very goods, etc. We do pay a lot of attention to what they say. During the panel, they have a discussion and they write a panel summary collectively that is the result of the collaboration among your three reviewers. They may change their minds, but they can't change their reviews. We don't allow that. So you look at the panel summary first, and so there may be a contradiction there, but understand, in discussion, the other two panelists may have convinced the other one that they were wrong. And this is where you look for what your key strengths and weaknesses are. Suppose you're approved, we fund about 30% of dissertation improvement grants. It'll never be so good again in your career. Getting funded carries some obligations in terms of reporting and so on that we will expect of you and that have to be done. Most of you will get declined. You know, don't think it's the end of the road for you or a failure. Read your panel summary in particularly carefully. Call up the program officer. Talk to him, whoever managed it. Talk to him about what went on and decide if you want to revise and resubmit. If you want to resubmit, pay a lot of attention to that panel summary. Do you detect enthusiasm for your idea? If you don't, there's something majorly wrong. But you can see if they feel like it's enthusiastic, but there's a flaw in the methods or something, that's pretty readily addressable. But if they aren't enthusiastic about the idea, you better rethink it. And ask, are the concerns really big, like they think the whole idea stinks, or are they minor? You just, you know, there were better techniques available, something like that. If you say, oh, there's not much here, I got a couple hours, I'll revise it and put it away and I'll send it in next year, that's probably not a good idea. You want to think really hard about, rewriting a substantial part of any proposal that's been turned down. Something about it didn't capture someone's imagination enough to let them overlook the flaws that every proposed research plan has. Everyone has gaps and something that's not there and something that's not right. But an enthusiastic response over the first page can carry you a long way over those difficulties. And make sure that you include a response to these concerns in your project description the next time you send it in. So the reviewers see, oh, they took the panel summary really seriously last time. They really went out and they fixed this thing. My graduate research fellowship program, we could talk a lot about this.
Is there anybody here interested in the graduate research fellowship? No, okay, just want to make sure before we...
All right. Read this document. Number one, read this document and the grant proposal guide. Read this document. You don't need to write the number down. Go to NSF's website, look at GRFP. Read this document. It's the solicitation. Read this document carefully. Read this document and pay attention to what it has to say. And the grant proposal guide, which talks about other things. There will be about 2,000 this year. Currently it's $30,000 a year plus $10,500 in institutional allowance. Notice they haven't caught on yet that this is not the full overhead. But these are different. They're fellowships. I mean, so technically they're awarded to you, although the money's sent to the university. But it's not the same reporting requirements on the university's end that a grant is. So this is probably okay. The deadlines for different directorates vary. The one for bio is November 18th. They're all within a week. U.S. citizens and permanent residents only. You should have less than 12 months of graduate study. There are some other specifics, like how many credit hours if you're a part-time student and so on. And you need to be enrolled in a graduate program at either the master's or the PhD level. And these will be evaluated on the same two merit criteria. The parts are a little bit different. There's an essay that's more like a college essay about why you want to be a scientist. But there's also a 2-page grant proposal, possibly the 2 most difficult pages you'll ever write in your life, because you don't know a whole lot at this point. You don't have very much space, and it's got to be really compelling. Final words of advice here. Make sure you understand where you're submitting, whether the subject and approach is appropriate. Read this grant proposal guide every time you're going to submit a proposal. The first thing you ought to do is look at this. Don't submit until you're ready. People have looked at your proposal, said this looks good, And feel free to talk to program officers and ask us questions, which you now have an opportunity to do. Thanks.
So do previous reviews, if you are resubmitting a proposal that didn't make it the first time, do they influence then the current reviews? Or can people go back and look at those?
If a panelist, we often will make the panel summaries available to reviewers from the previous submission, so they can assess. And what we're concerned about is not having panelists run you in a circle. You know, panel 1 says, "Oh, don't do A, do B." Panel B says, "Don't do B, do A." You know, we don't want that to happen.
So is there a panel for the pre-doc as well, or is it reviewed?
The pre-doctoral grants are reviewed by a panel. There are not individual reviews written. There's only a panel discussion. It's run by the Oak Ridge National Laboratories. It's actually contracted out on NSF, but they ask us to recommend panelists and reviewers. Have you ever served on one of these? No. The panelists don't see the proposals until they arrive for the panel, and so they have a day or two to read the ones they're responsible for and to take a few notes, and then they just go right into discussion. There's a lot of them. Yeah, it goes really fast. Apparently, I'm told like 2 to 3 minutes discussion per proposal, per pre-doc. So, you know, catching their attention is absolutely vital.
So where would the reviewers like to see this additional funds go? So we have some money to do our research for our dissertation, I know that. So if we have this additional fund from NSF, would the reviewers like to see this money go to most into doing additional experiments to improve the grant, or more like to travel, to attend meetings and share the findings?
We don't have an answer for that, as you'll often find with NSF. You know it when you see it. So I can tell you like a couple of specifics. A biogeography project on a group of lizards with a largely Palearctic distribution, some in South America, and some relic populations in Australia. The advisor had money for the North and South American research, did not have in any grant anything that said anything about Australia. The student argued that, you know, these relic populations could be so informative about the evolutionary history of this group, and then they needed the money to make a trip to Australia. It was very compelling. Great. You could see, you know, it'd be a fine dissertation without that. It was, you know, their advisor had never been to Australia. And a certain student could have done that. But this clearly could add an enormous additional component to the dissertation that would elevate it from a good dissertation to maybe something, you know, it's something unique because nobody had ever looked at this group in Australia. That's an ideal sort of situation. So something that your advisor can't pay for that would add and just take your dissertation and elevate it to a different level is the perfect thing.
Do you guys have a preferred like format for both? Like, so I've been looking at a couple different people's project summaries, and they range from being like kind of like a specific aims page with like a little paragraph each about intellectual merit and broader impacts, versus like a whole like a page divided into intellectual merit and broader impacts. Is that
The grant proposal guide says that the project summary should have a clearly labeled intellectual merits and broader impact section on it. We're pretty loose about that. We would rather you did that because it says it and it makes it easy. but we will actually read every word of your project summary, and if the last sentence, the whole broader impact say, I'm going to work with an undergraduate in the lab, we will let the grant go through. And if it doesn't say that, it's returned without review.
And the actual project description, you guys don't care about the specific, like, if we have whatever subheadings or whatever?
No, all I can say is, the reviewers have a lot of these to read, and you can talk to Mohammed about how much spare time he has, and to do things like take on extra duties, like to write 20 reviews of proposals in 3 or 4 weeks, and when he's going to get that done, it probably involves late at night. It probably is not an ideal time. And if you give them 8 pages of single-spaced, 10-point font with no headings, no bold, no figures, no idea, the first impression you get is this person doesn't know the first thing about this research because they think everything in this 8 pages is equally important. And I know it's not. And so you lose, I think about making life easy for your reviewers. Tell them why this is so cool. This is not the time to be shy and say, oh, maybe they'll figure it out. Tell them why what you're doing is cool.
I've heard that the graduate research fellowship tends to be more based on the credentials of the student rather than the actual project they're proposing, just because they're not necessarily held to that project. Is there any truth to that, or?
It's both. Ones that get funded tend to articulate an important problem and show in 2 pages that they understand what significant unsolved questions there are and give some idea about how you might go about addressing those. I had one. I did 27 drafts of my 2-page project description. It was good.
Do you have any advice for the broader impact section for the pre-doc application?
Acknowledge that money given by the federal government carries a debt, a responsibility to society, and that think about how your project might contribute to one or more of the broader impacts categories. You don't need to be very specific about what you're going to do, but certainly acknowledge that you understand the responsibility that comes with being a scientist and funded by the federal government.
Does the amount of money you're asking for in the DIG actually come into play at all in terms of decisions?
It's a maximum of $15,000.
Right. But if say they wanted 4,000 and they only needed 4,000 versus asking for 15,
I that's the same thing. Most reviewers go, what's wrong with this student? They couldn't think up something that would cost $12,000 or something? It's fine if you really don't need any more than that.
But it doesn't come into play at all. Like they say, oh, well, we have this much money, and if we fund one 4,000 and one, no. Okay.
No. We take money out of our general program funds for all of the dissertation improvement grants that we think are worth funding. Our group thinks, the Division of Environmental Biology think this is some of the most important funding that we do. It's certainly for us the most productive funding. There's more papers published off of dissertation improvement grants. If you do the number of papers for dollar, you would make people like Mohammed look really bad. A good dissertation improvement grant could have as many papers coming out of it as a $600,000 project. This is the reason, though, a lot of divisions don't do it. They say it's just too much work for a $15,000 reward. That, you know, it's just involves too much program officer and community time. I don't think our community feels that way. I've certainly, every panelist that everyone I've ever asked to be on a dissertation improvement grant panel has been enthusiastic whether they could do it or not. And the ones that come and do it, they're just like, you know, they're like, this is the most important thing that I've done this year. You know, so, you know, we think that these are very important. You know, and I'm sorry that we can't convince our colleagues in MCB and the rest of iOS to do it as well, because we do think that there's a demand out there that, you know, it really meets a need. Yep.
Is it necessary to present any legal permits or ICOP forms to conduct our field work?
You'll need them. You'll need them when we get to the funding point.
Okay.
You know, if you can